kitchen felt colder than usual, even though the furnace hummed steadily through the walls. My coffee sat on the counter, forgotten and cooling in its mug. I stared at the note she'd left by the toaster. Morning. Early meeting. Don't wait up. Love, C. It wasn't the note itself that got to me, it was the way her handwriting had changed. Sharp, angular, hurried. Like even the effort of signing her name was too much. She didn't always sign with C. It used to be Clara with a looping flourish. Sometimes a small heart sketched near her name. That was gone now. It had been gone for months, just like the rest of her. I sat down at the kitchen table and stared out the window. The autumn wind rattled the glass, leaves skittering like whispers across the driveway. I sipped the cold coffee, its bitterness matching the taste in my mouth. There was a time when mornings like this felt sacred. Clara would move around the kitchen, humming some song she only half remembered, her hair in a messy bun. We'd share quiet smiles over toast and eggs. It wasn't glamorous, but it was ours. Now the silence felt hollow. Dead. I wasn't naive. I wasn't one of those men who clung to blind optimism and ignored the obvious. I saw the signs as clearly as the morning sky outside. The way she guarded her phone like it held state secrets. The way her perfume had changed, something expensive and floral, a scent that lingered long after she walked by. The way she stayed later at work. Always meetings. Always clients. Always excuses. It wasn't like I didn't ask. I brought it up. Gently, at first. Are you okay? You've seemed distant. Her answer had been predictable. Just work. It's been stressful. But the look in her eyes gave her away. A flicker of guilt, quickly buried beneath a practiced smile. I could tell when someone was lying. I'd spent years reading body language, tones of voice. I used to think it was a gift. Now I saw it for what it was, a curse. Because every time Clara's eyes darted to the side or her voice faltered on a word, I felt it in my gut. Something was wrong. The problem wasn't just the lies. It was the ease with which she told them. Like she knew I wouldn't press, wouldn't dig, wouldn't dare to pull at the threads unraveling our life. I stood up, pacing the kitchen, running a hand through my hair. It had been a long time since we'd fought. Maybe that was part of the problem. No arguments meant no passion. No fire. Just a quiet, simmering resentment growing between us like a chasm neither of us wanted to acknowledge. When Emma, our teenage daughter, wandered into the kitchen, she didn't even glance at the note. She reached for the cereal box, poured herself a bowl, and leaned against the counter with her phone in hand. Morning, I said, forcing a smile. Morning. She didn't look up. Your mom left early for a meeting, I said, gesturing toward the note. It felt ridiculous to even bring it up. Emma shrugged, spooning cereal into her mouth. Figures. She's always gone these days. I froze, the words hitting me harder than they should have. I stared at Emma, her eyes glued to the glowing screen in her hand. She wasn't angry, just detached. Like this was normal. Like Clara's absence didn't bother her anymore because it had become routine. She'll be home for dinner, I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. Sure, Emma muttered. Whatever. She finished her breakfast and disappeared back upstairs, leaving me alone with the note and my cold coffee. I crumpled the paper in my hand, tossing it into the trash. The house was silent again, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards and the distant hum of the furnace. I checked the time. Clara had been gone for 2 hours. I'd told myself I wasn't going to check her location anymore. That it was a breach of trust. But trust was already in short supply these days, wasn't it? I unlocked my phone and hesitated, my thumb hovering over the app. I didn't want to be this man. I didn't want to be the kind of husband who needed to track his wife just to know where she really was. But I opened the app anyway. Her dot blinked on the screen, a pulsing marker on a map of our town. She wasn't at work. She wasn't anywhere near her office. My stomach tightened as I stared at the location. A cafe on the other side of town. A small place, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. Not the kind of spot you'd choose for a business meeting. I set the phone down, the blood rushing to my ears. I told myself it could be nothing. Maybe she was meeting a client outside the office. Maybe she wanted a change of scenery. Maybe, I was overthinking it. But the weight in my chest told me otherwise. The front door creaked open, and Sam shuffled inside, dragging his backpack behind him. He dropped it on the floor and kicked off his shoes. His face was flushed from the cold, and his hands were red, the way they always were after walking home from school. "Hey, bud," I said, trying to sound normal. "Hi, Dad." He smiled, and for a moment, it was like nothing was wrong. Like the cracks in our family were invisible, hidden beneath the surface. He opened his sketchbook and settled on the couch, flipping to a page filled with dark, swirling lines. I watched him from the kitchen, my heart aching. He didn't ask about Clara. He didn't even mention her. Neither of the kids did anymore. It was as if we'd all silently agreed to stop expecting anything from her. I leaned against the counter, staring out the window as the afternoon light began to fade. The note in the trash seemed to mock me, its crumpled edges poking out like a jagged wound. Something had to give. And when it did, I knew it wouldn't be pretty. By the time Clara got home, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the house bathed in gray shadows. The door opened and closed quietly, like she was trying not to wake a sleeping animal. I was sitting at the dining table, the overhead light casting sharp angles across the room. I didn't bother hiding the fact that I was waiting. She stepped into the room, brushing her hair back with a hand and offering me that practiced smile. It didn't reach her eyes. It hadn't in a long time. "Hey," she said casually, slipping her coat off and draping it over a chair. "How was your day?" I leaned back in my chair, arms crossed. "Quiet." "How was the meeting?" She paused, just for a second. Most people wouldn't have noticed it. But I did. Her fingers fiddled with the strap of her purse before she answered. "Productive," she said, her voice light. "We're rolling out a new campaign next quarter, so there's a lot to go over." "Sounds important." My tone was flat, and I saw her notice it. She was good at pretending, but not that good. "It is," she said, moving toward the kitchen. "Have you eaten yet?" "I can." "I know you weren't at the office." The words came out sharper than I intended, slicing through the room. She froze mid-step, her back to me. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The hum of the fridge filled the silence, the ticking of the wall clock marking each second. "What?" she said finally, her voice tight. I stood up slowly, the chair scraping against the floor. "You weren't at the office." I checked. "So where were you, Clara?" She turned to face me, her expression carefully blank. "Michael, what the hell are you talking about?" "Don't do that," I said, my voice rising. "Don't stand there and act like I'm crazy. I tracked your phone. You were at a cafe across town. What were you doing there?" Her lips pressed into a thin line, and her eyes flashed with something I couldn't quite place, anger, maybe, or fear. "You tracked me," she said, her voice low. "Do you hear yourself right now? Do you realize how invasive that is?" "Don't turn this around on me," I snapped, taking a step closer. "I wouldn't have to track you if you weren't lying to my face." "I'm not lying," she said, her voice shaking now. "I was meeting a client." Bullshit. The word exploded out of me, louder than I intended. Upstairs, I heard Sam's bedroom door creak open, and I forced myself to lower my voice. Don't insult me, Clara. I know what this is. I know what's going on. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, I thought she might deny it. But then her expression shifted, cold, defensive. You don't know anything. Then tell me, I said, my voice breaking. Help me understand why the woman I married is sneaking around, lying about where she is. Help me understand why you look happier in a text than you do in this house. Her face flushed, and I saw her jaw tighten. I don't have to explain myself to you, she said, her voice ice. I don't deserve to be interrogated like this. You're my wife, I said, my chest tight. I deserve to know the truth. She grabbed her purse, her movements quick and jerky. I can't do this right now. Clara. I need space, Michael, she shouted, and the words hit me like a slap. I need air. I need to think. You're suffocating me. I stared at her, stunned into silence. She pushed past me, grabbing her coat and keys. The door slammed behind her, and the sound echoed through the house like a gunshot. I stood there for what felt like hours, the air heavy and sharp around me. My fists clenched at my sides, nails digging into my palms. I wanted to punch something, to yell, to do anything to release the pressure building in my chest. But I didn't. Instead, I grabbed a bottle of whiskey from the cabinet and poured myself a glass. Upstairs, I heard Emma's footsteps. She stopped at the top of the stairs, then turned back toward her room. She didn't come down. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't need to. The whiskey burned as it went down, but it didn't help. Nothing did. My mind raced, replaying every moment of the argument, every lie Clara had told, every crack that had formed between us over the past year. She didn't come home that night. I stayed up, staring at the front door, hoping, praying, that it would open and she'd walk in. That she'd tell me she was sorry. That she'd tell me I was wrong, and everything was fine. But the door stayed closed. And I was left alone with my thoughts, the house colder and emptier than ever. By the time the sun came up, I'd made my decision. If she wasn't going to give me the truth, I'd find it myself. I woke up with a pounding headache and the bitter aftertaste of whiskey still on my tongue. The sunlight streaming through the window felt like a cruel joke, too bright, too cheery for what the day would bring. Clara still wasn't home. Her side of the bed was untouched, as pristine as if she'd never existed. Maybe that was the point. I went through the motions of the morning, coffee, a half-hearted attempt at breakfast for the kids, while my mind churned with possibilities. Clara was good at hiding things. I'd give her that much credit. But no one could hide everything. And I wasn't going to sit around waiting for her to come clean. Not anymore. After Emma and Sam left for school, I went to work. Not my actual job. God knows I wasn't in any shape to manage a meeting or even answer an email, but the real work. The kind that might break me if I wasn't careful. I started in her office. Clara had a neatness to her that could be unsettling. Everything in its place. A perfectly curated facade. But facades always had cracks if you knew where to look. I pulled open drawers, scanned the bookshelves, even checked under the cushions of the chair. Nothing. Just the usual clutter of bills, work files, and random odds and ends. Then I saw her gym bag. It was sitting by the door, just where she'd left it 2 days ago. I'd walked past it a dozen times without thinking. Now it felt like it was staring at me, daring me to open it. The zipper hissed as I pulled it open, the sound too loud in the quiet house. Inside were the usual items, a towel, a water bottle, sneakers that looked like they'd seen more parking lots than gym floors. But tucked in the side pocket was something that didn't belong. A phone. Not her phone. Not the one she carried everywhere like it was glued to her hand. This was a different one. Smaller, older, with a cracked screen and a cheap plastic case. It wasn't locked, and when I turned it on, the screen lit up with a cascade of notifications. I stared at it for a long moment, my thumb hovering over the Messages app. This was the moment of no return. Whatever I found here, I couldn't unsee it. But the thought of putting it back, of leaving this unanswered, made my stomach twist. I opened the app. The messages were there, clear as day. A thread with a contact named J. Short for Jared, I assumed. Or maybe just another layer of secrecy. My hands shook as I scrolled through them. Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again. Think of me tonight. I'll be thinking of you. Does he suspect anything? Each one felt like a slap. I kept scrolling, my chest tightening with every word. There were photos, too. Her smiling, wearing a dress I'd never seen before. Her hair done in a way she hadn't bothered with in years. Her face glowing in a way that had nothing to do with me. And then there was the last message. Tomorrow. The usual spot. Noon. My grip tightened on the phone until my knuckles went white. I didn't need a map to know where the usual spot was. The cafe I'd tracked her to the day before. The one on the other side of town. I closed the phone and slipped it back into the bag. I needed to be calm, strategic. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the kids. About what kind of example I'd set for them. I couldn't afford to lose my temper, no matter how much I wanted to smash something, anything, into pieces. I spent the rest of the morning in a haze, waiting for the clock to creep toward noon. I told myself I'd stay in the car, that I'd watch from a distance, that I wouldn't confront her. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. The anger bubbling inside me wouldn't let me stay silent. When the time came, I parked across the street from the cafe, the engine still running. I saw her almost immediately. Clara, sitting at a table by the window, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup. She looked serene. Happy, even. It was a face I hadn't seen in years. And then Jared walked in. Tall, confident, with a smug grin that made my blood boil. He leaned down to kiss her cheek, and she didn't pull away. They laughed at something I couldn't hear, their heads tilted close together like they were the only two people in the world. The door handle was cold under my hand as I stepped out of the car. My feet moved before my brain could catch up, carrying me across the street, through the door, and into the cafe. The bell overhead jingled, and Clara looked up. Her face went pale. Michael? Her voice was barely above a whisper, her eyes darting to Jared, then back to me. I didn't stop. I didn't care who was watching or what they thought. I walked straight to their table and stared down at her, my chest heaving. Don't stop on my account, I said, my voice low and sharp. Go ahead. Keep laughing. Keep pretending. Michael, I can explain, she started, but I cut her off. Explain what? I snapped. The lies? The late nights? The messages on your second phone? Her eyes widened, and I saw her mask crack, just for a moment. Jared shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat. Maybe we should, he started, but I turned on him so fast he nearly fell back in his chair. You don't get to speak, I growled. You don't get to sit here like a smug little bastard and pretend you're anything but a homewrecker. Michael, stop, Clara said, her voice trembling. This isn't the place. No, Clara, I said, my voice rising. The place was our home. The place was our bed. But you chose here. You chose him. The cafe was silent, every eye in the room on us. I didn't care. Let them watch. Let them see what betrayal looked like. Clara reached for my arm, but I pulled away. I trusted you, I said, my voice breaking. I trusted you, and this is how you repay me? Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought she might cry. But then she straightened, her expression hardening. You want the truth, she said, her voice cold. Fine. I'm not happy, Michael. I haven't been for years. And it's not just me. You stopped trying a long time ago. So don't stand there and act like you're the only one who's hurt. The words hit like a blow, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. The cafe spun around me, the walls closing in. And then I turned and walked out the door, the sound of her voice following me like a ghost. I drove aimlessly for hours after leaving the cafe, the weight of Clara's words pressing down on my chest like a boulder. The truth she'd flung at me, harsh, unforgiving, echoed in my mind, louder than the hum of the engine, louder than the rush of the wind outside. I'm not happy, Michael. I haven't been for years. What was I supposed to do with that? Was it an excuse? A justification? Did it make what she'd done any less of a betrayal? My grip on the steering wheel tightened until my knuckles turned white. Part of me wanted to go back to the cafe, to finish what I'd started, to let Jared know exactly what I thought of him. But what good would that do? The damage was already done. Eventually, I found myself parked outside the house. The lights were on in the living room, casting a warm glow onto the driveway. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the place I'd called home for years. It felt different now, colder, emptier. Like I was an intruder looking in from the outside. When I finally stepped inside, Emma was sitting on the couch, her legs tucked under her, her phone in her hand. She looked up as I closed the door, her eyes narrowing. "Where's Mom?" she asked, her voice sharp. I hesitated, unsure how much to say. Emma was 15, smart and observant. She'd been picking up on the tension for months. But there was a difference between suspecting something and knowing the truth. "She's out," I said finally. My voice sounded hollow, even to me. Emma's gaze didn't waver. "Out where?" I set my keys on the counter, avoiding her eyes. "I don't know, Emma." She didn't say. Her phone dropped into her lap with a thud. "Are you kidding me? She's out again? What is she even doing?" The frustration in her voice hit me like a slap. It wasn't directed at me, not really, but I felt it all the same. She deserved answers, but I wasn't sure I could give them to her. "Not yet." "She'll be back," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. Emma shook her head, standing up. "Whatever. She's always gone anyway." She stomped up the stairs, her bedroom door slamming shut a moment later. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the empty space where she'd been. This wasn't just about me and Clara anymore. It was about Emma. About Sam. About the pieces of our family that were breaking apart in ways I couldn't fix. I poured myself another drink, letting the whiskey burn its way down my throat. The house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that made you think too much, feel too much. I sat down at the table, my head in my hands, and tried to figure out my next move. It was nearly midnight when Clara finally came home. The door clicked shut softly, and her footsteps were tentative as she stepped into the house. I didn't look up. I stayed where I was, sitting in the dark, the empty glass still in front of me. She paused when she saw me, her breath catching. "You're still up." I laughed bitterly, the sound echoing in the silence. "Of course I'm up. How could I possibly sleep after what you said?" She didn't respond right away. Instead, she set her bag down and leaned against the counter, her arms crossed. "Michael, Don't," I said, cutting her off. "Don't try to explain. Don't try to justify it. I don't want to hear it. Her jaw tightened, and for a moment, she looked like she might argue. But then she sighed, her shoulders sagging. What do you want me to say? I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. I want you to tell me why. Why him? Why any of this? Clara's eyes glistened, but no tears fell. It wasn't about him, she said softly. It was about me. About how I felt, how I didn't feel anymore. Didn't feel what? I demanded. Love? Respect? Anything at all? Her voice broke when she answered. I didn't feel alive, Michael. I felt empty. Like I was just going through the motions every day, pretending to be someone I wasn't. The words hit me harder than any insult. And you think I didn't feel that too? You think I didn't struggle? But I stayed. I fought. I didn't go running to someone else to fill the void. She looked down, her hands trembling. I know. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. But I can't take it back. I shook my head, my anger rising again. You don't get to be sorry, Clara. Not for this. Sorry doesn't fix what you broke. Her voice cracked. I didn't mean to hurt you. But you did, I said coldly. You hurt me. You hurt Emma. Sam. This family. And for what? For some cheap thrill? For a few stolen moments that made you feel alive? She flinched, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. I didn't plan this, Michael. It just happened. I laughed again, the bitterness seeping into every word. It didn't just happen. You made choices. You lied. Over and over again. Don't stand there and act like you were a victim of circumstance. Her silence was answer enough. She looked at me, her eyes pleading, but I turned away. I couldn't look at her anymore. Not without feeling the weight of everything we'd lost. Where do we go from here? She asked finally, her voice barely a whisper. I stared out the window, the darkness outside matching the hollow ache in my chest. I don't know, I said. But this? This can't go on. Clara didn't respond. She just stood there, her quiet sobs filling the space between us. And for the first time in years, I felt like I didn't know the woman standing in front of me. The woman I'd built a life with. The woman I'd loved. I left her there and went upstairs. As I passed Emma's door, I heard the faint sound of music playing, a barrier between her and the chaos downstairs. Sam's door was closed too, his light still on beneath the crack. They didn't deserve this. They deserved better. But better felt a long way off. The morning after Clara's return was heavy with silence. The kind that suffocates, wraps itself around you, and squeezes until there's nothing left. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the steam rising from my untouched coffee. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual, or maybe that was just my imagination. Clara came downstairs eventually, her movements slow and hesitant. She didn't look at me as she made her way to the counter, poured herself a cup, and leaned against the sink. For a long moment, neither of us said a word. Michael, she started, her voice barely above a whisper. Don't, I said, cutting her off. My tone was flat, lifeless, but it was all I could manage. Not now. She swallowed hard and nodded, gripping the edge of the counter like it was the only thing holding her up. I could see the exhaustion etched into her face, the redness around her eyes from crying. I didn't care. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough to erase what she'd done. Emma stomped down the stairs, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her phone already in her hand. She glanced between us, her expression sharp. Are you two done fighting yet? She asked, her voice laced with bitterness. Clara flinched, and I felt a pang of guilt, not for Clara, but for Emma. She didn't deserve to be in the middle of this, to have her world cracked open by something she couldn't control. "Emma," I said gently, but she shook her head. "Don't," she snapped. "You think I don't know what's going on? You think I haven't noticed Mom sneaking around, always gone, always on her phone? I'm not stupid." Clara's breath hitched, her hand flying to her mouth. "Emma, Save it," Emma said, her voice breaking. "I don't want to hear whatever excuse you're about to make." I stood up, stepping toward her, but she backed away. "I have to go," she said, her tone colder now. "Don't bother driving me. I'll walk." Before I could respond, she was out the door, leaving Clara and me alone again. Clara sank into the nearest chair, her face buried in her hands. "I didn't want this," she whispered. "I never wanted this." I stared at her, my anger flaring. "But you did it anyway. You made the choices that brought us here. What did you think would happen, Clara? That no one would notice? That you could keep living this double life without consequences?" Her shoulders shook as she sobbed, but I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. Not this time. I couldn't forget the image of her and Jared, laughing together, their heads close like they were sharing some private world I'd never be a part of. "I'll leave," she said suddenly, her voice trembling. "If that's what you want. I'll pack my things and go." "And what about Emma? About Sam?" I asked, my voice sharp. "Do you think you can just walk away from them like you walked away from us?" "I'll do whatever you want," she said, her eyes pleading. "Just tell me what to do." I shook my head, the weight of her words sinking into my chest. "It's not that simple, Clara. It's never been that simple." She didn't respond. She just sat there, her face pale, her hands trembling. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her alone with her guilt. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I couldn't focus on work, couldn't concentrate on anything but the gnawing ache in my chest. I spent hours pacing the house, checking my phone, waiting for Emma and Sam to come home. When they did, Emma barely looked at me. Sam was quieter than usual, his eyes darting between me and Clara like he was trying to piece together a puzzle he didn't want to solve. After dinner, I pulled Clara aside. "We need to talk," I said, my voice firm. She nodded silently, following me into the living room. We sat on opposite ends of the couch, the distance between us feeling like a canyon. "I talked to a lawyer," I said, watching her face carefully. Her eyes widened, but she didn't interrupt. "We're going to separate. For now. I'll stay here with the kids. You can figure out where you want to go." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away. "Michael, please," she whispered. "Can't we try to fix this?" I clenched my fists, the anger bubbling up again. "Fix what, Clara? How do you fix something that's been broken for years? How do you fix trust when it's gone?" She didn't answer. She just sat there, tears streaming down her face, her hands gripping her knees like she was trying to hold herself together. "This is what's best for the kids," I said finally. "They need stability. They need to know that, no matter what happens, I'm here for them." "And what about me?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Don't I deserve a chance to make this right?" I looked at her, my jaw tight. "You had chances, Clara. Every time you lied to me. Every time you chose him over us. You had your chances, and you threw them away." She broke then, her sobs filling the room. I stood up, unable to watch her any longer. "Start packing," I said, my voice cold. "You can stay through the weekend, but after that, I want you gone." I walked upstairs, leaving her to cry alone. Emma's door was closed, but I could hear music playing softly inside. Sam's light was on, and I peeked in to see him sitting at his desk, drawing in his sketchbook. "Hey, buddy," I said, stepping inside. He looked up, his eyes wide and sad. "Is Mom okay?" I swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "She's fine. Don't worry about it." "Are you mad at her?" he asked, his voice small. I hesitated, then knelt beside him. "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes," I said carefully. "Big mistakes. But it's not your fault, Sam. None of this is your fault." He nodded, his eyes glistening. "I just want everything to go back to normal." I ruffled his hair, my heart breaking. "Me too, buddy. Me too." But I knew normal was gone. And there was no going back. Part 5 continues the emotional fallout, with Clara's actions pushing Michael to make the difficult decision to separate. The focus remains on the children's reactions, adding depth and complexity to the story while highlighting the consequences of betrayal. Part 6 will bring closure and explore the aftermath of these choices. The weekend came and went in a blur of tense silences and empty words. Clara moved through the house like a ghost, her presence fading with every box she packed. Emma avoided her entirely, slamming her bedroom door whenever Clara tried to approach. Sam hovered in the background, quiet and confused, his sketchbook his only escape. By Sunday evening, the car was loaded, and Clara stood in the entryway, staring at me like she was waiting for something. An apology, maybe. Forgiveness. Closure. But I had nothing left to give her. "Are you going to say goodbye to the kids?" I asked, my voice flat. She hesitated, tears brimming in her eyes. "Do you think they'll even want to see me?" "They're your kids, Clara. They deserve a goodbye." She nodded, wiping at her face as she climbed the stairs. I leaned against the wall, listening as she knocked softly on Emma's door. "Emma?" Her voice was shaky, tentative. There was a long pause before the door creaked open. I couldn't hear Emma's response, but her voice was sharp, clipped. Clara said something, too soft for me to catch, and then the door slammed shut again. She tried Sam next, and his door opened immediately. He was a better soul than any of us, too young to hold grudges. His small arms wrapped around her waist, and I heard him whisper, "Don't go, Mom." Clara's sobs echoed down the stairs, and I closed my eyes, clenching my fists against the ache in my chest. This was the right thing to do. It had to be. But that didn't make it any easier. When she came back down, her face was pale, her eyes red and swollen. "Take care of them," she said, her voice breaking. "I always have," I replied, the words sharper than I intended. She flinched, but she didn't argue. She opened the door and stepped outside, her suitcase wheels clicking against the pavement. I stood there until her car disappeared down the street, the weight of the moment pressing down on me like a vice. And just like that, she was gone. The weeks that followed were a strange kind of hell. Emma refused to talk about Clara, burying herself in schoolwork and her phone. Sam clung to me more than ever, his innocent questions about when Mom was coming back twisting the knife a little deeper each time. I threw myself into parenting, trying to be everything they needed, even when I felt like I was barely holding myself together. Mornings were a rush of cereal bowls and backpacks, afternoons a flurry of soccer practices and art projects. At night, when the house was finally quiet, I sat in the living room, staring at the empty space on the couch where Clara used to sit. Her absence was everywhere, in the hollow sound of her office door clicking open when I ventured inside, in the faint trace of her perfume that still lingered in our bedroom. I hated her for what she'd done, but some nights, I hated myself more for missing her. The anger came in waves. Sometimes it was a dull ache, a low hum of resentment that I carried with me through the day. Other times, it was white hot, a storm that left me pacing the house, clenching my fists, and muttering curses under my breath. I wanted to call her, to scream at her, to demand answers to the questions that still haunted me. But I never did. She texted occasionally. Short, careful messages about the kids, asking if they were okay. I kept my replies terse. They're fine. We're fine. Everything's fine. It wasn't, but she didn't need to know that. One evening, a month after she left, Emma came downstairs while I was doing dishes. She stood in the doorway for a moment, her arms crossed, her face unreadable. "Can I talk to you?" she asked. "Of course." I dried my hands and turned to face her, bracing myself for whatever was coming. She hesitated, then sat down at the table. "Do you think Mom's coming back?" The question hung between us, heavy and loaded. I sat down across from her, searching for the right words. "I don't know," I said honestly. "But if she does, things won't be the same." Emma nodded slowly, her fingers tracing patterns on the table. "Do you hate her?" I sighed, leaning back in my chair. "I don't know. Some days, I think I do. Other days, I just feel sad. For what we lost. For what could have been." She looked up at me, her eyes sharp and searching. "Do you think she loved us? I mean, really loved us?" The question hit me harder than I expected. "I think she did," I said carefully. "I think she still does. But sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes people make mistakes that break things." Emma's gaze softened, and for the first time in weeks, I saw the walls she'd built around herself begin to crack. "I don't hate her," she said quietly. "But I don't know if I can forgive her." I reached across the table and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "You don't have to forgive her, Emma. Not now, not ever. That's your choice. But don't let the anger eat you up inside. You're too smart, too strong for that." She nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "I miss her." "I know," I said, my voice thick. "I miss her too." The first snow came a few weeks later, blanketing the town in white. Sam was ecstatic, dragging me outside to build snowmen and throw snowballs until our hands were numb. Emma stayed inside, watching from the window, a small smile playing at her lips. That night, after the kids were in bed, I sat in the living room with a glass of whiskey, staring out at the snow-covered yard. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, and I picked it up to see a message from Clara. "How are the kids?" I stared at the screen for a long time before typing my reply. "They're fine. We're fine." I set the phone down and leaned back, letting out a long breath. For the first time in weeks, I felt a strange sense of peace. The pain was still there, sharp and aching, but it wasn't all-consuming anymore. It was just a part of me, something I'd carry with me but wouldn't let define me. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and silent, covering the scars of the past in a blanket of white. It wasn't a fresh start, but it was something. And for now, that was enough.